Hi, I'm Sasha.
And hi, I'm Reshma.
I'm a senior in high school and a lot of my friends are getting ready to vote. Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Of course, I love speaking to first-time voters like yourself and your friends.
Can you tell us a little bit about the first time you voted?
My parents became U.S. citizens when I was 8 years old, and so I distinctly remember going to vote with my mother when I was 8, and continued to do that even before I was old enough to vote. And I was very excited when I was eligible to vote. And the first time I voted, I went to the polling station at 6 a.m. because I was so excited, and I continue to do that every election.
That's so cool. Voting is so much more complicated than I thought it would be. Why do they make it so hard?
Well, Sasha, it's important to remember that when this country was founded, only white men who owned property could vote. And every other group that's been able to vote has had to fight for it. As you know, we had a Civil War, and we had the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote. And then, as you know, this year we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and celebrating when women got the right to vote. But what people don't realize often is that it took women almost 100 years to get that right. And when the 19th Amendment was passed, it was still only really white women who got the right to vote, right? Black women were still restricted because of Jim Crow laws, and that wouldn't change until the 1960s. Asian Americans, people like ourselves, couldn't vote until the 1950s. So those in power want to keep that power, and if they expand the electorate, it makes it harder. They have to fight harder to keep that power because they have to cater to more people. And this is why I think that for our democracy right now, the most important thing is for everybody to vote, because that's the best way for us to have an inclusive democracy where everyone is represented.
It's so interesting learning about the history of voting and how important it is for our country. A lot of my friends are saying that their vote does not matter because they don't live in a swing state.
So I think that, obviously in a presidential election, because of the way the electoral college is and structurally it gives maybe more weight to votes from smaller states, it's still important to vote. And the popular vote matters for the historical record. And also you have to remember that there's all these other races, right? You're voting for your senators, your congressmen, you're voting for state legislature. And all of those, your city council races, it might be a school board race in the district you live in. So it's really important to vote because those races matter, and sometimes they actually impact your life a lot more than the presidential race.
So those other races that you mentioned, how can I find out more information about them?
So I would visit vote411.org, and you put your address in there, and once you put your address in there, it gives you all this information about who your elected officials are and what role they play and who's on the ballot this time, because different elections happen at different times, and that's another thing important to remember, because often people only will vote in a national election, but they don't remember that there's an election. Like next year in New York City, we have very important city council races happening, and I hope that everybody takes an interest and votes in those.
Do you think it's better to vote in person or by mail?
I think at this point, we're about 9 days away from the election, so unless you're at high risk for COVID, which since you and your friends are young, maybe not, I would highly advocate that you vote in person. Mail-in ballots, I think, are great. It gives an option, especially this election, because of people like my parents who are seniors, they voted by mail. But mail-in ballots, even during normal times, are much more likely to be contested because people can get the signature wrong, or you have to have it postmarked in some states by election day, and some states you have to have it delivered by election day, and that causes a lot of confusion with people. And you often have mail-in ballots that then don't get counted. And now that we're so close to the election day, it would be hard for you to correct something like that. And in a lot of states, we're doing mail-in ballots for the first time. And anytime someone does something for the first time, and in your case, you guys are all voting for the first time, right? You're more likely to make mistakes. This way, when you go to the polling station, the information will be there for you, and you can.
Do you think mail-in ballots can be subject to fraud?
I think it'd be very hard for them to be subject to fraud. So this is both in-person and mail-in ballots, but a professor at MIT did this study over 20 years where he basically found that you're more likely to be hit by lightning in the United States than to have voter fraud, right? It's something like 0.004% likelihood of that happening. And part of the reason is we just don't have that much interest in voting, which is the thing that bothers me a lot. Like, I wish people are out there trying to commit fraud, but they're not, right? And so, that issue aside that I have, that we don't have enough people participating, right? The other reason, when you request a mail-in ballot, they have a code assigned to it, right? And then that's tracked through the mail. So the way you could commit fraud is, well, someone has to be able to go and put in all these people's addresses and request those mail-in ballots and fill it out. So that takes a lot of time and effort, right? Which I think would be difficult. Or the other question is, well, once you've dropped off the ballot somewhere, someone could open it up. But usually you're required to have a signature at the back of the envelope. So someone would have to open it up and close it again, or be able to forge your signature somehow, right? So all of those things I find to be very hard to do. So I don't have any issue with mail-in ballots in terms of fraud. I do think that they're likely to be contested because your signature may not match. Like when I registered to vote, I used to write like a little fancy Nancy, right? And now my signature is just scribble.
Yeah.
So my mail-in ballot was always going to be subject to a second look because that signature doesn't match.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible or someone is able to hack polling station machines?
No, I mean, obviously I shouldn't say no because anything is possible, right? As we've seen in this year, right? But our election system is so antiquated and so decentralized. There are 10,500 different localities handling elections in this country, right? Because it's done at the county level. So if right now the fear is that there's some foreign agent, right? Whether it's Russia, China, Iran, someone who's trying to hack our system, they would be able to do it perhaps in 1 or 2 counties because they have access to it. Somehow it's enough, access that they got that they could do that. But it'd be really hard to do, like for instance, in New York. I know in New York City, I've been a poll worker. It's really hard to do because we also have paper ballots that we track, and the system would be really hard to break into because to do a cyber attack, you need to have more sophisticated computer systems, which we actually don't have in many of our county elections.
What should we be bringing to the polls?
So as you've probably seen, right, there are long lines around the country right now, which is for me very exciting to see this surge of interest in voting. So I'd be prepared to wait in line, comfortable sneakers, which I see you have great sneakers on right now, right? Bring water and a snack, and I'd bring something to read, or maybe young people like to bring headphones so you'll listen to music, and bring the phone number for pizza to the polls because they've been delivering pizza to people who've been waiting in long lines across the country. So which is I think is a great idea.
Do we need to bring IDs? I've heard in some states that we also have to bring voter IDs to be able to vote.
So it depends on the state.
Okay.
In New York, which is where I live, as you know, right, we don't need to have ID and no one should ask you for ID. The only time that could happen, if you're a first-time voter and perhaps on your application you didn't fill out all the full information, because here you do ask for a driver license ID number or state-issued ID number or your social security. If there was some issue with that, then if you're a first-time voter, you may be asked for your ID, but other than that, you don't. But there are lots of states around the country that do require an ID. The one that I can think of right away is Alabama. And it has pretty restrictive ID laws where you need a state issued ID, which is a driver's license or like a hunting license qualifies, but a lot of other things don't. And that unfortunately then excludes a lot of young people because you may not have been able to go get an ID yet. And you may be working or in school from 9 to 5, and that's the only time that the DMV where you would get such an ID is open. Or you could have a situation where there are some counties in states that require IDs where there is only one location open and it's not ADA compliant. So if you're someone who's differently abled, who doesn't have access, you're in a wheelchair, you may not be able to get an ID and then hence not be able to vote.
Are you worried that we'll have problems with election day results?
So I think that we need to be prepared to not have results the evening of November 3rd, right? Which is usually we're used to that. You're too young to remember, but I remember the election of 2000 where I was like waiting for the results, and then I finally went to sleep at 3 a.m. and I woke up at 7 a.m. and there were still no results, and that was Bush v. Gore, which ended up going to the Supreme Court, as you probably have heard of that election. And you never remember 2016, obviously. So I think that what's going to happen this year, because of the large number of mail-in ballots, it's going to be hard to have results on November 3rd. States like Pennsylvania, like New York, we are doing mail-in ballots for the first time. In Pennsylvania, you can't even count the mail-in ballots until 7 p.m. on election night. And so in any situation, the large number of mail-in ballots would be overwhelming to the number of people who have to count it, because we have a poll worker shortage this year. And in any year, we always have, I think our election system is overwhelmed and we need to update it. But the problem, especially with poll workers, is that average age is over 65 normally, right? And this year, because of COVID, many of them cannot come and be poll workers, and we have a shortage. So it's going to take a while to count the mail-in ballots in a lot of states, and you could take many days, maybe even weeks, I think, to get the final results.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions. Everyone remember to go out and vote.